Now we are on the stage. The good news is that I have been just promoted as the panelist. So very good Monday to all of you. I'm Susanna Pettersson. I have a great honor to guide you through today's discussion. I am Director General at Nationalmuseum in Stockholm, working with fine arts and design, and also Associate Professor in Museology. And my academic field is on museum history, collection studies, and the future of museums. I have a great collection of colleagues together with me on today's panel: Guðbrandur Benediktsson, Olov, Amelin, and Niklas Cserhalmi. Now, unfortunately, I received just 4 minutes ago a message from Karina Jatinen that because of an emergency situation, she is not able to join us. But I will present you the panelists who are present. Guðbrandur is asking, by the way, in the chat that could somebody allow him to jump in, and here he is.
Yes.
Yes, Guðbrandur Benediktsson. He's a historian, director at historical museums in Reykjavík City Museum, and that museum covers everything from open air to archaeology and maritime issues. Then we have Olov Amelin from Jamtli in Östersund, which is in Sweden. Olov Amelin is director of this wonderful museum, also a combination of open air, archaeological objects, culture, history, and even arts. Before starting in Jamtli, Östersund, Olov was working at the Nobel Prize Museum in Stockholm as its director. And then we have Niklas Cserhalmi, who is Director General at Museums of Work, Norrköping. And what is also breaking news for all of us today is that Niklas was very recently elected as a chairperson or president of Sveriges Museer, which is Association of Swedish Museums. So I guess with this combination of different fields of expertise, different countries, different profiles and backgrounds, we are going to go through a selected number of questions in this panel. Before asking the first question, I say some words about what we are going to do. Culture heritage and social culture organizations, as we know, represent great societal value. And closing of the museums because of COVID-19 demonstrated the very strong symbolic values that museums have in our societies. And we are going to touch that during this conversation. We will focus on questions that most of which have to do with museums and society. And now, if you think back in time, you know that museums have always been for the people. Since the days of Enlightenment and the great era of founding of the museums in 19th century Europe. What has varied during the centuries and decades is how we have understood museums' role in the society, as well as some of the key expectations. I'll take one example from relatively near past. If you think about the discussion that started to formulate at the very end of 1990s and early 2000, that question was really polarized. And it was polarized between the two extremes, one being that museums should be silent places for contemplation, whereas the others thought that museums should more or less represent places that can provide to masses. And it was this kind of a temple amusement park discussion. There are lots of buzzwords that have been circulating around during the past 20 years, starting from edutainment, combination of education and entertainment. We have talked about community involvement. We have talked about participatory strategies, accessibility, diversity, and much, much more. And here comes the question to all of you, the panelists. From today's perspective, how do you see the role of the museums and the society? What should we understand from today's perspective? And I would suggest that you, Guðbrandur, you would start.
Okay, thank you. Well, in a couple of last months, we've been working on renewing our strategic planning for the Reykjavík City Museum. And we have, of course, been focusing on the role of the museum in the society and its impact, and actually how it's relevant to people. So relevance is one of the key words we are working with. Of course, our planning is related to and based on the cultural policies of Reykjavík, and actually also the human rights policy the city has. And it has influenced both the cultural policy of the city and as well as our work, and it will be closely linked to that. And of course, the planning of the Nationalmuseum of Iceland, which is leading in our field. And that work is based on focus groups and dialogue with different stakeholders, so to say, and groups in the society. And of course, we take in account the trends and ideas on the field of the international museum professionalism and academy. We watch the discussions and debates regarding ICOM's museum definition and the ideology regarding design thinking, which we found quite interesting. And it was a good session on that on Museum Next meeting in London in the year 2019, very influential for us. And there are several keywords that we have been focusing on and will be focusing on, thinking how culture and museums are part of society's infrastructure and that they are increasing the quality of life for people. Museums are and should be recognized as an important social institution related to well-being and actually close to maybe welfare issues, at least what we are stating and considering and thinking about and discussing. And according to that, we are running outreach programs focusing on different groups in the society, minorities and forgotten groups, so to say, and also encouraging people to participate in our work. For instance, renovating old vessels and so on, something like that. Participation and ownership is very important in that sense. And actually, like, working with shareholders and making people more determined into our work. That's all part of our audience development. And during the time of the lockdown here due to COVID-19, relatively mild lockdown here in Iceland, but we had to be in discussion with the authorities and those who were responsible for the museums here in Iceland, pointing out the importance of museums, and like museums are safe zones for people to visit and highly appreciated by people, making life as normal as possible in these strange times. So actually our point in few words were that museums were vital. And also we learned during the time of lockdown to use new methods, more digital mediation and digital exhibitions. And when those couple of weeks when the museum were actually closed, we had exhibition, for instance, on bus stations all around Reykjavík. And the idea was that since the people cannot come to us, we try to go to the people. Thank you.
That's an excellent example. Bus stations all around the city of Reykjavík. One more follow-up question for you, Guðbrandur. So you mentioned the welfare issues. Would you like to be more specific on that? Do you have any brilliant ideas that you could share with us and examples?
No, it's just that, well, it's related to us in our mind, at least in my mind, to well-being of humans and so on. But I can also mention that we saw an example in the Open Museum Aarhus, where they were working with dementia, people with dementia, visiting the museum, and so in that sense, it was pretty close to clinical welfare issues, so to say. So that was quite inspiring for us, and we have been working in that field as well. So that's, we might say that's where welfare issues and museum work come together. So that's something we would like to work more on.
And I couldn't agree more. There is lots to explore on that field, that how museums can contribute to the welfare of the society. And you mentioned that during the COVID-19 situation, you really convinced the stakeholders that museums are safe to visit and museums are vital for the society. Now, if we move on to our next panelist, Olov, how would you continue from here? If you think about museums, their role in society and their, let's say, relation to knowledge building.
Yeah, I mean, the question you asked is really at the core of what museums are about. So it's a big question, and it's a question that we had to address in another way during the pandemic, when I think most of us have moved out a lot of our work when it comes to lifelong learning or popular education, or what we in Swedish call folkbildning. It's not a very, there are no good translations of that word into English or into many other languages, as far as I know. But we have all moved out to the internet and to social media. I mean, that was the, what should I say, the most obvious step to take when the pandemic did strike us all. But I think this is also important from.
Now there seems to be a tiny technical moment, at least on my screen. Guðbrandur, you're nodding, so maybe we're losing Olov. He must surely find his way back to this digital platform, and when he does that, then we have to remember to ask him to also to explain that what is this fantastic background he has behind his back. Meanwhile, I can.
He is back, but
he is back, and now put the mic on.
I'm back, and I heard your question.
Yes.
What you see behind me is actually from one of the buildings that we have in our open air museum, a beautiful building from the 18th century. But I started to talk about the importance of lifelong learning and how we work with popular education, and that is one of the pillars on which democracy rests. And museums plays a very important role when it comes to communicating well-researched and knowledge-based information to all visitors. And this requires a very tight link to the academy, either by staff members who are, well, have a background in research or have a strong connection to the academy, or other close relations to the research community. Because we have seen in recent years lots of museums that have been challenged by politicians or by other men of power. A good example, or I would say a very bad example, but a clear example, is of course the museum in Warsaw about the Polish Jews, which was really, they simply sacked the director because he represented something that the politicians didn't like. And recently I've read in the newspapers that the same thing is actually happening at Auschwitz, which is of course very scary when the narrative is changed to fit to a certain political context. So we always have to remember that knowledge is a social entity that depends on how much we trust the educator and informant. And that's really where the museum could play an important role as being a trusted sender of knowledge and science to the community, and thereby provide or be a voice in the democratic conversation in a society. So that's my take on your question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your wise words. And I'm sure that we couldn't agree more on that. I mean, trusted sender of knowledge and the voice in the society, absolutely. And we'll come back to the knowledge-related issues for sure. Now, thinking from your perspective and your career change from Stockholm and Nobel Prizes to Jamtli, Östersund, northern part of Sweden, and with the different scope of topics. As a museum director, do you need to use different strategies, or are they the same?
No, I need to use other strategies. And one important difference is that the museum in Östersund has a much stronger position in society than the Nobel Museum has in Stockholm. It's a great difference. We have roughly 200,000 visitors every year in a city with 60,000 inhabitants. I mean, that's clearly a very special role in society that we can play, since basically all important activities here, being the National Day or celebrating Midsummer, takes place at the museum, and the citizens come to Jamtli. So in Stockholm, we always had to struggle with all other colleagues like yourself, of course, but the Nobel Museum was really a museum that attracted lots of tourists and of course lots of school classes, but not to a large extent the citizens of Stockholm. So it is definitely a big difference.
Yeah, and this is also a very good reminder that once we are analyzing our museums, our potential, our relation to the society, it's all about how we communicate with different stakeholders, with different target groups, and how we use the knowledge that you were so wisely talking about. Then we will move on to Niklas. You have such an exciting, you're wearing two hats in this conversation, but if you are first focusing on that part of that hat that belongs to you as Director General of the Workers' Museum. So would you tell something about the ways to involve the community, talking about target groups and different stakeholders?
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you so much for having me in this panel. I will actually start in 1974 when Sweden made a new cultural policy stating that museums and culture has the goal to reach every citizen in Sweden. And since then, we have been struggling and we have not come very far, I would say, in reaching all. We still, in the museum sector, mainly reaches people with a middle-class background in urban areas. But we have one brilliant example from our museum, which was started in 1991. And during those times, it was suggested that the Museum of Work would, of course, as museums normally do, collect objects. And then the museum directors started to look at what kind of objects they would collect and understood that the scale of the industrial heritage, the scale of those objects are a completely different one compared to bourgeoisie homes or even peasants or farmers' objects. And one understood that if you build the world's largest museum magazine, it's pretty quickly filled up with one production line. So you have to build the world's largest museum magazine again. every second year, and it would be impossible. So instead, they started to focus on what is left in the country, on the countryside, and found about, and now we have about 1,600 small volunteer-driven museums dealing with industrial cultural heritage all around Sweden, where the objects still remain. So instead of taking the objects out of their context and putting them into a museum store or a magazine, they are out there, and the people who has the knowledge how to take care of them, how to show them, still runs them. And this also is the answer of how to reach outside the middle class and outside the urban areas, because those kind of museums, these voluntarily driven museums about industrial heritage, they have a completely other audience than we have. They have the working class, they have the men, they have the people without university education, and also the people who's running those museums are mainly men without university education. So some kind of failure with collecting objects that was transformed into collecting people's histories and people's stories about working life and everyday life, transformed into a success story where Sweden now has 1,600 volunteer museum taking care of the industrial heritage on site, which is marvelous.
Yeah, that's really a success story, because it so beautifully relates also to the idea of the big museum, right? So that's culture, history all around us, so that we should really embrace that. And also highlights how we should critically approach our collection strategies. So not to repeat automatically the patterns that have been repeated over and over again, but to think differently and to have the boldness of doing that.
And I shall also add that we have the government's task now to serve these museums with courses and networks and seminars and workshops and so on. So we are working 3 full-time people here works constantly with supporting this movement.
In one of our earlier discussions, you, Niklas, you said that you don't, that your, let's say, one-liner is to work together with and not just for. And would you say something more about that?
And that is, we also have large, we do a big amount of exhibitions at the museum of work in the central museum, so to speak. And here we are trying to involve our audience as much as possible. And so we have this kind of corny saying that we should not do things just for the audience, but together with them. So we take in the target group, we try to involve them as early as possible in the making of the exhibition, because then we learn a lot how to promote the exhibition and what the target group is interested in, and also how to address the target group. And mostly it's youth that we have reached in this way. We are trying desperately to also include people in working life in these target groups and to build exhibitions together with them. But it's much harder because they don't have the time. They have their families and their works and their hobbies and so on. So, but with youth people, it's been working marvelously good, and we are still trying to find tools how to reach the grown-ups.
That sounds like a good example of also showing responsibility in the society, involving people, involving communities, involving the volunteers. So thank you, Niklas. From participatory strategies and working with the community, I would like to mention a topic that Karina Jatinen, who is not taking part to the panel discussion today because of the emergency situation. Those of you who might have joined a little bit later to the panel, I just want to repeat that she is not unfortunately joining us today. but I can tell you that her example in relation to museums and society had been intangible heritage, which is, I think, yet again, a very, very important part of this discussion once thinking about museums and society, how we as museums work, what kind of strategies we decide to use. And I'm so sorry if my dog, which is barking because we are getting some mail through the door as we speak. So I hope it doesn't disturb you all too much. So intangible heritage, how we have to be able to argument and be articulate with topics such as our relationship with the forest. Karina has been working as a steering group member with the Forest Museum Lusta in Finland, and they are developing a concept together with a bunch of future researchers and a think tank that how the museum can actively build a role as kind of a facilitator or matchmaker, if you like, to encourage people to work with their relationship with the forest. And this is rather interesting example because in some countries this is very natural. People are very ill at ease with the forest, as in some countries forest can be really scary. But the forest relationship issue as part of the intangible heritage is something that all relate to from different perspectives. And of course there are many other areas and now also remembering the UNESCO listings of intangible heritage, those kinds of traditions that we really, really want to focus on from the preserving perspective. And we need to take on board as well once we talk about museums and society. Now, any more comments from you or questions to one another related to this first topic of ours, and then we can move on. If not, and I don't see any questions in the chat either at the moment, so then we move on to our section number 2 in our panel, which is related to can museums be radical? And now, this question I think is rather interesting because all of us who work at the museums know that museums use their tone of voice when addressing their target groups, from general audience to decision makers. Museums are big and very, very effective medias. They provide platforms on site and online that can encourage people to contemplate with the historical and contemporary contents, social issues, and even very tricky questions, difficult questions, but in a safe way. And sometimes museums are expected to be brave and even bold. This perhaps applies to, especially in the arts and contemporary art. And now, analyzing the different roles, different takes. So what would you say? Can museums be radical? Can they voice controversial issues? And now keep in mind what Olov just said about knowledge and those challenging situations with museums that have been censored even. Would you like to continue from that actually, Olov?
Yes, thank you. Well, this boils down very much to how we define radicalism, of course. But let me start by saying that I believe that museums should avoid radicalism in the sense that museums are not well equipped for short-term political campaigns or other campaigns. But of course, very often, I think we stress and we put forward knowledge-based statements that could be viewed as radical. But museums are usually very slow-moving institutions, and I think that's a quality that we have, and a quality that we really should stick to, because there are so many things in society that move very fast in very many directions, while museums with collections that might have been built up during decades or centuries is something else. And I think we have a very special viewpoint that we should care about, and that's this slow-moving institution that has built up knowledge and know-how for a very, very long time. And being in that situation means that we can also watch and comment on the fast-moving changes in society from a very special viewpoint. And I think that's important. I like to look upon museums as the elephants among knowledge institutions: big, wise, beautiful, and slow-moving. And I would like to continue to have it that way. Thank you.
Oh, I love that. Museums as elephants. I promise to comment this a little bit later on, but I'm sure that we all like to hear what the others wish to. Sorry, my dog is entering the study at the moment. We are losing Karina, but we are getting the dog. So I guess the balance is now somewhat fixed. Niklas, what would you say?
From elephants and dogs. I totally agree with Olov. I think he puts it very wisely and very good. And I also agree on the idea of radicalism. And what I would like to focus on is the museum's ability of credibility or trustworthiness. With internet and with social media, we are moving into areas where trustworthiness and credibility will be a highly after-sought capital or currency. With artificial intelligence and deepfake, it will probably be totally impossible to judge if a news article is true or if it's fake. It will almost be impossible for us as TV viewers or text readers to decide if the message is a fake message or if it is authentic. And it will probably be so that people don't have the possibility, and I include myself in that. It will be impossible for me to judge each news story, for example. So I will probably start to have source reliability upon the sender and not the message. So I will have a source reliability in these kind of TV programs, but not in these ones, and so on. And if museums can be one of those senders that is looked upon as a reliable source, and if we can gain source trustworthiness from the visitors, then that capital and that currency is worth extremely a lot for us, and it can be transformed into more financing, more audience, and much more. It's good for us in every way. And when we have that credibility, we should, as Olov says, we absolutely should engage in pressing and hard issues of contemporary things, but we should do it from the platforms that we control and we know. When it comes to objects, when it comes to fact reliability, when it comes to tight communication and collaboration with the research community and so on. And if we have that, if we control the platform and if we really know what we're talking about, then we absolutely should go out there in the debate. But always have an eye on the credibility and always understand that this is a capital and a currency that we will try to grow and not waste on issues that we actually don't control. And also, as Olov said about Poland and Hungary, it's extremely important that we do it as museums professional with a long-term perspective, and not as something that we do with a political driven or a very short-term, up-to-date move. So long-time reliability and from the museum's professions, then we can be radical, but we should always have the idea of credibility on it.
And I guess we need to defend our cases, right? You have a very interesting example from your city of Norrköping. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Absolutely. Just 50 meters behind me is the City Museum Norrköping that has recently won the award of this year's museum in Sweden. So they are the Museum of the Year in Sweden. And they got that prize mostly because one wonderful exhibition about Norrköping, the city during the World War II, and Nazism, and how Nazism and Nazists in Norrköping has been living since. And they posted a newspaper article where right-wing politicians were shown in the exhibition, and contemporary right-wing politicians were shown in the exhibition, and they they sued the museum for publishing this article. And when it landed at the police, they said that, okay, this is a newspaper article. It's not a crime to put it out in an exhibition, and so on. And there was a big debate both in Norrköping and all in Sweden, because we also have the new Museum Act, the museum law, that states that politicians should have an arm's length to museums. And well, this is a perfect example of how a museum relies on its knowledge of history, but can take a part in the modern debate, but from its platform. And it has been used as a way of strengthening the arm's lengths to politicians in Sweden.
So from Olov's slow-moving institutions, museums as elephants, to Niklas, knowledge capital, society, credibility, controlling the platforms. Now, Guðbrandur, what is your take to this question?
In general, I have to agree with my colleagues regarding the question about radicalism and all that, and also the importance of credibility. And to my opinion, museums, at least history museums, should work, should function like universities. They should work with academic accuracy and integrity to improve knowledge and seek the truth, if the truth is to be found. Therefore, I believe the relationship with the academia is quite important, and the universities, so to say. But yes, a museum can be, and they should be, progressive in that sense, and mind-opening for the audiences, even sometimes shocking, dealing with hard issues from the past, for instance. And we know about the ideology of Svartesäker, the moment in Sweden. But as I said, museums should not be afraid to deal with that, but in an accurate and balanced manner. And again, like I mentioned earlier, relevance is important. Museums should be addressing various topics, big issues that are discussed in the society. What are those issues? Definitely like environmental questions and something like that. And I see museums in that sense as open venues, welcoming people to come and tell their stories and ask questions. Venues, platforms where new voices can be heard. And in that sense, the museum should not be preaching. It's maybe a question of dialogue, not monologue. Thank you.
not a monologue, but a dialogue. And from there, I would actually take you to one very, very concrete example, which I think is an excellent example of activism and even radicalism. I was living in London in early 2000, and then later again, some years ago. And at the time of the first period of my presence in London, I started following very carefully what Victoria and Albert museums were doing. They had just hired a young curator, Kieran Long, which is actually now working in Stockholm as Director General for Arbetets, Architecture and Design Museum. And at the time, Kieran had initiated a program which is called Rapid Response Collecting. And that was actually, it was a brilliant move, because now thinking about Victoria and Albert Museum, which is a bigger elephant than any of us could think of, and hard to, turn quickly. So they needed to come up with something that could be fast, tool that could be used when society around us is actually changing. And they created a gateway to react to the world's different twists and turns by purchasing objects and putting them on display right away. Examples of these objects that were acquired were, for instance, 3D gun that could be purchased from internet and 3D printed, very problematic. That was bought and displayed. They bought the pink knitted hats that thousands and thousands of women were wearing when demonstrating in Washington, D.C. They acquired hard disks from the WikiLeaks procedures and displayed in the galleries. They bought jeans from Primark, because Primark, as this kind of cheap and fast fashion enterprise, had bought their jeans from a factory that had just collapsed in the other part of the world, and caused, of course, big humanitarian suffering. So that's an example how even elephants can sometimes be fast. And that's, of course, that's a very, very interesting topic now, thinking about that, how we can use the knowledge capital in a very responsible way. And what you said, Guðbrandur, about the relationships to the academia, that's absolutely something that we pick up from this conversation. Now, in the interest of time, we move forward. And we are going to finish the discussion with thinking about our biggest challenges and potential. As we know, we are businesses, as any other businesses within culture industries, and all of us, we have different funding models, which also affect the ways we can operate, whether we are private or completely public, whether we have boards or don't, and so on. We use contemporary business strategies to survive. We invest in fundraising. We invest in key competencies that are broader and much more complex than, for instance, 50 years ago. And we are competing on the market of people's free time. Now, thinking about the next steps and the future, how do you see the challenges and the potential? Would you like to begin, Guðbrandur?
Yes, well, one of the byproducts of the lockdown due to the COVID is that it revealed, at least here in Iceland, in our case, how big part of our budget was related to tourism. So there was a huge gap in that. And therefore, we have to stress that our core, what were our core values and purposes, so on. And that, of course, is the, like we've been discussing the social importance of the museum. So, and luckily, I believe we managed to get the authorities and the general public, I believe, to understand that. So even though museums are and should be, of course, taking part in servicing tourism and be welcoming people from all around the world, it was maybe a risk zone where we're entering, where at least economically, how big part of it was of our budget. So, and also, so both the Icelandic Museum Association, ICOM, I believe, and NEMO, they've been doing questionnaires after the COVID era, and then just checking out if all museums will survive, and that will be, of course, interesting to see. And there's, I believe, in several countries the stakes are quite bleak, and the situation very critical. But we'll see how that will work out. What this has also taught us here to stay stronger is working together. The museums here in Iceland and also internationally, and with different, cultural institutions like here in Reykjavík and the school system. That has given us kind of a stronger base for our core existence. But of course, other difficulties and challenges is like Olov has mentioned, and Niklas, especially when he was talking about turning the failure into success with getting people to work to collect and preserve things, is the difficulties we will be facing in this time of mass production to preserve things and collect. So that's something that I believe we'll have to rethink and have a sharp focus. Otherwise, we'll end up in a dead end, so to say. And of course, we can look at methods and ideologies like from Samdok. Samti's documentation we probably all know about. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And then from there, I would actually give the word to Niklas. Would you say something about the digitalization issues? I know that they are very close to your heart.
Yes, absolutely. I would say that the two big challenges we have is to, as I started with, reach all citizens that pay taxes and support the museums, giving back to them, and the other large, the other big issue to deal with now is digitalization. And I would say that the last 10 or 15 years in Sweden, each museum has either been left alone or has chosen to go in its own path when it comes to digitalization. And we have tried to fix this on our own. And I think the analogy that is being done rather often with the railways and the railroad system is very good. The railroad system started with entrepreneurs doing their own width of the tracks and their own kind of systems of tuggers and their own kind of systems and their own timetables, and even the clock time wasn't combinated. You know, it was when the sun was in zenith, then it was 12 o'clock. So it's in Sweden we had a lot of time zones, so you couldn't actually decide on, if we had too many time zones. So and there is where we are in digitalization right now in Sweden. We don't cooperate, and we have invented our own systems, and we can't really deal out very much to the citizens in this area. So we need to work together and to kill our darlings and to really get down into work and accept that the idea that we have, even if it's the best idea, of course, then we have to work together and kill some of our darlings to go forward, because we can't afford to have these different systems. We have to unite and pool our resources and combine them, and only then we can hopefully solve this huge issue.
Yes, you're so right. Collaboration and working together, that certainly is a key nationally and internationally. Now, we have some comments and questions in the questions and answers. I would like to combine one of those together with you, Olov. Here's a question related to that. Do we see any contradictions between museums or museum as a sender and museum as a facilitator? Can both these positions be united? And this could be linked with the question to you, Olov, which is that how to stay relevant in the society.
Yes, and well, how shall we stay relevant without losing our soul? I think that's really the question. But the question about sender and facilitator, well, I think that as long as we stay true to the foundation for a museum, and everything that we produce and send is really reliable and based on fact, then of course we can facilitate for other organizers, people or whatever that we find interesting and that somehow are relevant for the things we are doing, and provide a stage for them. But it's always important then to stress that these senders are actually, or the senders that we facilitate, they represent themselves and not the museum. So in that respect, the museum could very well be a platform for discussions and debate in many ways. Now, maybe could I go back to your example with Kieran Long, because I think that's an interesting example, because what he did was actually to use the fundamental tools that the museum use, collect artifacts, put them on display, make an exhibition. And that was very clever. But what we've seen in recent years is that many museums, including my own museum, we work a lot on social media. And I think that's, of course, because it's very efficient and we reach a lot of people. And I think we should, of course, continue to work on social media. But we have to remember that Facebook, Instagram, etc., that's not neutral that's not a neutral platform. It's actually a platform provided by a big commercial company. And we are when we produce things for social media, we always have to be aware that we are not only among friends. There are lots of people on social media that want to reach out with their message that could be quite the opposite of based on knowledge or science. I would like to stress, as well as Niklas did, and I think also Guðbrandur was also touching upon that collaboration is really important for museums, especially when we look at the fast technical development that becomes more and more expensive. If we want to develop new interfaces that we control in order to reach our audience, it's basically too expensive to do for a small museum in the countryside. We need strong collaborations, and we need networks where small and local museums can work together with large museums with much stronger resources, as we do together with the National Art Gallery. And in that way, we could also reach academic excellence. We could reach researcher and people with know-how that we never could reach on our own, but we could do so through collaboration. I think that the museum sector should be an intellectual nervous system in a society where we shall be able to reflect on our history as well as looking out on aspects of global life. And we could do that if we create these big networks of museums that collaborate, share both experiences and know-how with colleagues in both nationwide and of course on an international base. I think that's really the way forward. Start strong collaborations and build networks. Thank you.
Thank you, Olov, for your excellent words. And this response, I guess, in a fantastic way, in another question, or to another question, which is in the questions and answers. Pirjo Hamari is asking that could we vision one change in society that we would like impact on as a museum, and can we take with us the idea of museums and intellectual nerve system in the society and relate that to what has been discussed with welfare, knowledge and academic excellence, facts, responsibility in the society, collaborations, and meaningful and better life for the people. So then we certainly have made the change. And with these words, I would love to thank all of you panelists today, Niklas, Guðbrandur, and Olov, and all of you who's joined us for the panel discussion. The topic is ever so important, and I only wish to congratulate the organizers for arranging such an important day, the Nordic Stakeholder Forum. Thank you so much.